topping PA5, a giant killer or just another overhyped product at reasonable price? Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It channel. Now what we have here today is topping PA5, which is actually an integrated amplifier. And quite often on the web I saw people calling it a power amp, which is not really, isn't it? Because it does have two sets of inputs and switch to choose between them, but more importantly it has a volume knob, volume control, and that's not a power amp. So it is a very simplistic, bare bones integrated amp, but it is an integrated amp. Now, part of the reason why this can be so small is because the power supply is located outside, inside of this pretty chunky power brick. So you connect this to topping PA5, you have here a green LED to see if power supply is working. Oddly enough, you don't have any LED notification on the PA5 itself. So it looks exactly the same like this if it's turned off or on. And because of that, I'm not even going to bother powering it because I have nothing to show you. It just looks like this. It has these two switches, one to turn it on and off, one to choose one of two inputs on the back. As you can see, both of these are balanced. And this is 6.35 millimeters jack. So you don't use very common XLR. And I suppose that decision was made because this unit is really small. So basically there is not enough space here on the back for big XLR connector. But this works just fine. By the way, I got these fine sturdy cables. They're called SKW. From Hi-Fi Go retailer together with this amp, so I can have something neat, functional and of a really decent quality to connect this amp to topping E50 DAC that's also using these type of connectors. And so far I can tell you that these are some quite nicely made cables. I didn't test them sonically wise, I didn't compare them to any other cables of this type, but they provide very stable connection and they look quality made for a really decent price. And last thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to connectivity, that on the back we have these speaker binding posts that accept both banana plug and spades and bare wire. But it's the same story as with affordable SMSL amplifier. These are smaller than usual, than you would find on most like normal sized amps. And because of that, you cannot actually hook all of the standard sized spades to this one. And as for banana plugs, they will go inside. It's like 4 millimeters banana is a common standard one. It will fit nicely, but it will not go in all the way. So I suggest using smaller spades, smaller sized spades, or shorter banana plugs if you can find those, or simply bare wire that's not too thick, because otherwise it might not fit. Now let's shortly talk about the power that you can expect from this small amp. It's quite reasonable actually. It's 65 watts into 8 ohms. And don't look at those spec sheets that says 140 or 120 watts, something like that. That's into 4 ohms with 10% distortion, and that's really high. That might be okay for like cheap micro stack or mini stack that comes from iiWi or something like that. I don't know, I'm just pulling memories from my childhood. If you remember those like very plasticky, low quality micro and mini stacks. And in my country, iiWi was popular brand when I was a kid, and it would state that it has like 200 watts or I don't know, 300 watts. But if you look at the specs, it would be something like, yeah, for 1 millisecond and with 10% distortion. It was not a continuous power with reasonably low distortion. But for a normal listening, it proved to be quite sufficient, even for not so sensitive speakers. For example, When I tested it with KF-LS50s that are just 85 dB, I could listen to most of my favorite music genres and songs as loud as I've ever wanted to. But sometimes I noticed that if I listened to a really silent recording, and for example, a lot of classical music pieces are like that, they have a lot of headroom between the average level of loudness of that recording until this maximum level, which is 0 dB. So some of these classical recordings can be minus 12 or even more than that. And in these rare occasions, I had to crank up the volume almost to its maximum, somewhere near that, to have sufficient loudness. And even though I have never completely run out of headroom, I was always having enough of juice. I just wanted to mention this because its gain, it's not really huge. And if you're used to listen to the music really loudly, or you need something to party from time to time, better look for something with more power and more gain. One really positive note about all of that is that no matter how hard I cranked it up, I didn't hear any sort of clipping or distortion. So the whole range of the volume control that you have is usable, which is really not the case with every integrated amp. A lot of them will tune their volume knobs that way that you get really loud at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. But if you move past 11, you already get some sort of clipping or distortion, so basically everything above that is unusable. And it's not like that with topping PA5. Sometimes I felt that I have to crank it up more than usual, but on all levels it sounds really nice and without clipping and without distortion. So I guess that topping simply decided to use more linear volume change, and I support that because that gives you more control, like finer volume step. And lastly, important to mention is that there is no remote control on board. So that probably signals that topping intended this little amp to be used mostly in a desktop environments, so you can just do it by hand. Because using it in a room, sitting in a couch, is a little bit inconvenient. You have to get up all the time and adjust the volume. But if you have a DAC with variable volume control, like topping E50, you can just crank this volume all the way up, so you basically turn it into a pass-through, something similar to a power amp, and in that case you're controlling the volume on your DAC. So yeah, that is an option, but I would definitely prefer to see a good old remote control for something that is basically a small and simplistic integrated amplifier. Now, all of that out of the way, how does topping PA5 actually sound? Can it really measure up to much pricier amplifiers like many on the web claim? Or is it simply an affordable amplifier that sounds as an affordable amplifier? Well, without dragging that too much, I'll say first that it does not sound as an affordable amplifier in a traditional sense. I'll just say that what I'm hearing from this amp is vastly outperforming what I'm used to get at this price point from these traditional brands like NAD, Rotel, Yamaha, etc. Because usually at this price point you would get a normally sized amp that has much more of material included in casing and switches and connectors and everything. It's a proper integrated amp. More inputs, as I mentioned, bigger binding posts that's easier to connect speaker cables to those. A remote control is usually on board. And compared to those, topping PA5 is so simplistic and it makes you wonder, can it justify its $350 price? But when I actually heard it, I immediately thought, yes, it can. Because this is a really simple, really bare bone product with great sound quality. And I'm talking, it's like several classes above these amps that are big and costs around $300-400 that I mentioned, have all of these features and remotes and connections. And for example, some of them that I reviewed were NAD D3020 V2 or Yamaha WXC50. I especially liked that one. That one was even more expensive at like $500 or something like that. And PA5 easily sounds better than both of these. And if you're wondering how much better, at what level it actually performs, I would say that it performs as good as Hegel H90 that I used to have and I also reviewed. And that's really not a cheap amp. It costs like 1,600 euros in my country, and I think it's probably like $2,000 in the US. But it is an all-in-one system that includes digital inputs, a streamer, and again, it's a proper integrated amp with more inputs, with a remote, with a screen. But as I mentioned, this topping PA5 for a fraction of that price has comparable sound quality. And to start describing PA5's sound signature, I'll say that it sounds really, really detailed. It really does have high resolution. Anything that's in the recording you can easily hear with it. So I'm going back to these similarly priced but more feature-packed amps of like $300-400 from NAD, Rotel, Yamaha, etc. These, at that price point, offer something that sounds much hazier and much more blended together than what topping PA5 is offering. While this topping does tone separation, layering and pinpointing of musicians and vocals and everything that's happening in the recording at a much higher level than those price-wise comparable amps. It's simply highly revealing amplifier. And in doing that, it's not the most musical one. And it's not the warm sounding one if you're looking for that. But don't get me wrong, to my ears it doesn't sound overly analytical or overly dry either. So what you do get is a really nice and authoritative bass line. If I listen to double bass or bass guitar or anything like that, notes have really decent weight and really decent grunt. This is not a lean sounding amp when it comes to the bass line. And drums, for example, have quite a bit of energy and decent amount of kick. Now, it's not the most energetic, most kicky and slammy sounding amp out there, but it's pretty decent. It sounds lively. It has quite decent amounts of energy, at least to my ears. Mid-range is forward, it's highly detailed and resolving, and there's plenty of texture. So vocals sound especially present and lifelike. Especially those textures from vocals are pronounced. So if you listen to something like Leonard Cohen, I, for example, simply love him, his voice will sound really magnificent, full, big, present and forward, and with all of these tiny crackly bits and sandy bits, it just everything is there. Now, because I said that PA5 is not the fullest and warmest sounding amp, this vocal may lack a little bit of rumble and just a little bit of chestiness. And if you like that, if you like your vocals to be a little bit spiced up, to be a bit fuller and bigger than life, this is not the amp that will do that. it does sound present, forward, detailed and textury, and in my opinion it has a decent amount of fullness, but if you're really looking for that, probably better to look at something that sounds even fuller and juicier, because this is not that kind of sound. And when it comes to the highest frequencies, I'm glad to say that they're well extended, again very detailed, but not too sharp, too analytical or overemphasized. Everything is there in right amounts, at least to my ears. So I could hear a lot of air from the recording. Cymbals sounded really nice and energetic and clean, and simply all of these frequency ranges combined sounded pretty neutral to my ear. And if there is a part to which you should pay special attention, it's probably, I'm returning to that, but I think that's important, it's probably that lower mid-range and upper mid-bass part, whereas topping sounds fast and detailed and textury, but it's not really juicy sounding amp. So if you want that type of sound, you have several options. One, simply buy a different amp, or two, use a source that's juicy in that section, like a DAC that sounds juicy and warm, or use such speakers, because something, if you want that type of fullness in that lower mid-range upper bass section, it will not come from this amp, you'll have to introduce it with some other component. But everything else was really top-notch. And this actually leads me to comparisons part, so I'm just quickly going to go through several of the amps that I've compared it to or I just had in my possession for longer periods of time, starting with something like NAD D3020 V2 that I had for some time with me. NAD D3020 V2 is a very warm sounding amp. It's really juicy sounding amp, but its detail retrieval and separation of the instruments, layering and the soundstage is nowhere near what this topping is doing. Topping is simply much more transparent. It is drier in the process in that lower mid-range upper bass section, but its bass line has more authority and more grunt. It's faster. It's a little bit punchier. Now I'm talking about real bass, not this like big and fuzzy upper bass that's like warming everything. Because that's something that NAD is doing. And if you really like that big, good old Santa Claus type of sound, you still might prefer it. But to my ears, what topping is doing is much more high fidelity. It's much more transparent, soundstage is deeper, everything is positioned much more accurately, and a lot of times I could definitely just imagine something happening like slightly on the right and off center, or left deeper in the soundstage. You don't get that with NAD. With it, everything is much more blended together and hazier. Edges of notes are not as clearly defined, and empty, clear space between instruments and vocal and other instruments is just not that clear and obvious and defined as with topping here. So here, just talking about the sound, not about features and functions. Look at that for yourself, decide what you need. Just talking about the sound, topping is a clear winner. But then moving to a much stronger opponent that's also cheaper, it's SMSL DA-9. This little thing sells for $250, and at the moment I reviewed it, I called it market disrupting amp. And I really think that's true. And that's also why I'm keeping this with me to actually compare every other amp that comes in for a review with this one. And let me tell you that PA5 to my ears sounds better, because it's mid-range, because it contains more information and better separation and better layering. Mid-range is more present and more textury. Leading vocals simply sound more present in the room. And again, you hear more of everything from the vocal. While bassline is quicker, but also slightly deeper and slightly more authoritative. It has a little bit more grunt than DA9. But DA9 does have a little bit more warmth. And that's like SMSL's signature lately. Its mid-bass is more emphasized, more pronounced. So it does give certain warmth to everything, but it's also less defined and simply blurrier. So think in terms that this one does provide warmer sound signature that's coming from that upper bass region, but topping PA5 being slightly drier in that section is actually beating DA9 in most other aspects, including deep bass, its authority and its grunt, mid-range, just detail retrieval from the mid-range, textures, overall presence, and layering and just how soundstage is developed, how securely everything is positioned in space, and how much clear, empty space around each of these players and vocals you can imagine, you feel there is. All of that is slightly better with PA5 than with DA9. But on a positive note, DA9 does have a remote, a screen, it's cheaper, so I still really like it, and I'll still keep recommending it in some use case scenarios. Now next, I already basically did this comparison before I talked about the sound. Something like Hegel H90 sounds pretty much comparable to this topping in terms of soundstage width and overall detail retrieval. There are slight tonal differences, with Hegel being more smooth, and it's more laid back sounding too. So when you look at your speaker setup, what you'll probably hear with Hegel is something that starts at the line where speakers are and then extends deeper behind them. So the soundstage is deep and laid back. And vocals and instruments are all arranged in that retreated soundstage. While PA5 here will bring everything just a little bit closer to you, especially lead vocals and lead instruments. Will feel closer in your room, in between your speakers, while still maintaining pretty decent soundstage depth if there is one in the recording. Also, I feel that topping can retrieve more texture detail and slightly more detailed transients and edges of notes. While Hegel will sound a little bit smoother, but not as revealing and not as attacky as topping PA5. In my mind, that leads to something that is sonically very comparable, and which one would you prefer would strongly depend on your own preferences as well as gear you paired this amplifier with. And if you're using like really sharp sounding DAC, for example, or just bright, slightly thinner sounding speakers such as monitor audio, you would probably prefer Hegel for its laid back and smoother, calmer approach to the music. But if you have fuller sounding speakers or fuller, juicier sounding DAC, such as Shitmodi Multibit or Denafrips Ares II, something like that, that has a lot of fullness, and as I said, speakers that has that too, you might easily prefer topping PA5, its focus on transients and textures, and that kind of detail retrieval that it's offering. And to my ears, it does have slight edge compared to Hegel there. Once again, I'm not commenting on features, functions, connectivity, richness, etc. I know that Hegel is a much bigger box, offering digital inputs and even a streamer, so I'm just commenting on a sound fidelity. The rest is up to you to decide. And finally, just for kicks, and because I could, I compared this topping PA5 to my own Acoustic Invader preamp and amplifier combination. And I've already made review about those. If you haven't seen that one, please go watch it. It's really something, because this combo that costs 2,400 euros actually retired my Hegel H90, but it has also beaten more expensive H190 as well as NAD D3020. So these are really serious pieces of gear. And the power amp itself is actually an ICE power module, the best one they produce, 1200 AS2, which has like 600 watts. It's much more powerful than what topping has here. And you can hear that. This combination has much more grunt and control over any speakers, even like a really insensitive ones. And this can push LS50s as high as they can take it, or any speaker for that matter. You can go all party mode with this. It also does sound a little bit fuller and juicier and just more musical, more connected, and also soundstage is bigger. It's just wider and more enveloping overall. If somebody asked me, I know this is an impossible question, but if somebody asked me how much better is that 2,400 euros preamp and amp combination than this small, really simple, small integrated amp, I would say, like, if you are listening to sensitive speakers and on moderate volume levels, let's just say for the sake of the argument that this sounds twice better than topping PA5. But it does cost 7 to 8 times more. And that actually leads me to the conclusion that if you're okay with what this small integrated amp is, but more importantly, if you're okay with what it is not, it's not a powerhouse. It has like 65 watts into 8 ohms, which is really decent for moderate levels, but it's not a powerhouse. It has like moderate gain of 19 dB, so if possible, it's ideal to pair it with speakers with just a little bit more sensitivity, but if not, it's still okay. It worked just fine with my LS50s that are 85 dB for moderate level listening. And it's also not a traditional big chunky integrated amp with lots of inputs and features and switches and tone controls and remote or maybe a screen. It doesn't have any of that. It has 2 sets of inputs, both are balanced, so you have to use the balanced source to feed it, and it has 1 switch, 1 volume knob, and that's it. And if you're okay with all of that, if you still think, yeah, okay, that does the job for me, it's a mighty good sounding amplifier. Just slightly drier when it comes to that upper bass, mid bass section, but really revealing and resolving and authoritative for its size. It's actually incredible. It layers greatly, it has presence, it has liveliness, and really good separation and layering. that you would expect from a traditional integrated amp from a well-known manufacturer that costs around $1,500. And with that, I hope I provided all the info you need in deciding should you or shouldn't you purchase this little amp. And if you decide that it's something that you could use or that you want, please use my links down below the video. That way you help the channel, you help the retailer that actually sent this in for a review. And thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, comment. See you next time. Bye.